Okay, so during this session, I'll provide you with an overview of the fraud landscape, outline what type of payment anomalies we are seeing, and introduce you to our payment controls product. I'll outline its core detection capabilities and show you an overview of the tool, and then I'll explain what's next if you want to begin your journey to actually onboard onto payment controls. And then hopefully at the end of the session, we'll then have a little bit of time for some Q&A if you did have any questions as well. So industry trends and rising risks. So what are we seeing in the industry today? What are the problems that our customers are faced with? To maybe start us off quite broadly at the beginning, it's important to note that fraud is growing, operational errors are growing, and the impact that this is having on banks is more and more visible every year. Now, to understand why those things are happening, we will first need to take a look at the payment industry and how the global landscape is changing as well. So it's important to note that it's more than just fraud is increasing, but actually the system itself has changed. And what I mean by that is we've moved from batch and controlled to real-time and distributed and always on. Now, while a lot of this change is extremely positive, for example, with more consistency, increased transparency, and faster, often instant payments, these positives don't come without their own challenges. And we're going to look at those in a little bit more detail now. So, for example, if we take faster and instant payments, processes become more rapid and automated, which is obviously excellent. However, that, of course, makes the risk of operational errors also becoming more likely, simply because that time window is smaller, and then that same level of rigor isn't put into place because that time window is shorter. Now, at the same time, if payments are becoming faster, this also means that that time window to actually recall and recover a mistake or payment once one happens is also reduced too. So even though we have this faster and instant payments available, which is obviously great for the industry, at the same time, this does contribute to fraud and operational errors growing too. Next, we have new industry players. Now, obviously, that's wonderful for the industry in many ways. For example, we have more optionality available and more innovative technology. However, again, this also creates new entry points and angles for fraudsters to then leverage, which wouldn't have been there before, again, contributing to that increase in fraud and operational errors as well. Next, we've got the rise of AI. Now, obviously, this is a bit of a given across the globe, not just in the payments landscape, but more comprehensively, we're seeing a rise of AI within all organizations and in all contexts as well. But really, when we speak about fraud, generative AI has totally transformed the fraud landscape, because what used to require time and skill and human involvement can now be totally industrialized, because actually a lot of it can now be done in seconds. So, for example, you've got things like highly convincing impersonation, so voice, email, chat can be done in seconds. Stolen credentials, and many of them in bulk, can be tested within seconds with minimal human input. And then also we have automation tools and malicious automation tools at that help fraudsters actually probe financial institutions for their weak points. Again, this really does show how, something that before that might have taken a very long time due to generative AI being available actually becomes automated, becomes much more simple, and it doesn't necessarily require the same skill set that it once did to poke holes in these financial systems. And finally, we've got the systematic uncertainty. Now, as the financial system becomes more digitized and globally interconnected, things like volatility in markets and geopolitical tensions then create moments of uncertainty as well. Now, all of these things combined all translate into regulatory pressure, reputational risk, and very real financial exposure as well. And that leads us nicely now to talk about payment anomalies. So the next three slides essentially help to illustrate the consequences of these trends. And what you can see here is a view from Swift Traffic, that we're actually able to look at cancellation requests or returned or rejected payments, and we can see some clear patterns from these. So if you look at the left-hand side, so among the requests for cancellation, you can see 60% of those are related to operational issues and errors. And very close behind is 40% related to fraud. Again, this is really key. And when we're looking at why this happens, it's essentially due to the case of fraud growing across the globe. So this is where the positioning of PCS starts to make sense, because PCS was designed not only to detect fraud, but also to identify operational mistakes early. So before they become exceptions, before they trigger manual investigations, and before they impact the customer experience. So next we talk about payment anomalies. Now, first, I think it's important that we maybe think a little bit about the definition of payment anomalies, because I think sometimes when we start speaking about anomalies, people immediately think, it's linked to fraud, but that isn't always the case. Anomalies themselves simply mean that they are sitting outside the norm. They're an outlier from your normal behavior, an outlier to the pattern. And now what we're going to look at is some 4 different types of anomalies that we look at today. So first is fraud targeting your institution. Now, when we speak about fraud targeting your institution, we're thinking about the classic high value, high risk cases where attackers try to move large sums of money out of a bank. They're usually sophisticated, often cyber enabled, and potentially impactful if not caught. So this is kind of your stereotypical fraud that people often first think of when discussing fraud. Secondary to that is fraud targeting customers. Now, this is now the most widespread form of fraud globally. So scams, impersonation, social engineering, account takeovers, and so on. They might not always be large individually. In fact, often they're not. But collectively, when you look at the value that they represent altogether, it's billions in losses and a huge operational burden for banks, especially given reimbursement obligations as well. Next, we have operational issues and errors. Now, here you can see we're moving away from the fraud use case of anomalies, but rather operational errors themselves. Now, this is the category that quietly consumes enormous amounts of time and resources. These issues create delays, require remediation, and often trigger customer friction. And often these are due to some sort of human error element as well. Finally, we have the out of policy payments. Now, these are transactions that aren't fraudulent and they're not operational errors, but they simply fall outside what the bank considers acceptable or expected behavior. So they may be part of just normal business, but simply they are actually anomaly. They're anomalies and they are outliers to what's the norm for you. Now that leads us quite nicely to the next slide, where we're actually going to be looking at quantifying the impact of these anomalies as well. So you can see really that fraud is no longer opportunistic. It's an industry. Okay, it's rising globally year on year. You can see in the UK alone now 40% of all crime is fraud. Okay, and that's a rise from 6% from the previous year. What's also interesting when we start to actually quantify this as well is actually institutions often only report a fraction of the fraud that they actually experience. So the true scale is significantly higher than what you're seeing on these slides. You can see typically, you can see on the fraud losses Europe 2024, the second bullet down, that typically they only report, the reported fraud only represents around 7% of actual fraud exposure. So again, actually the impact is significantly higher than even what we know today. And this is when we introduce payment controls. So Swift Payment Controls is a service designed to help banks detect and intercept suspicious payments before they leave the institution. And that's the key, right? It's an inception early on, using insights derived either from the bank traffic data or from the Swift network itself. It operates within the Swift infrastructure. It is network connected and it benefits from network-wide insights, not just local transaction history. Now, before I move on to the next slide, I think it's also worth noting we have around 1,300 BICs globally using PCS today across 130 countries. Those users are primarily leveraging our institution-based rules, which we'll talk about in a moment. and PCS was launched at the end of 2018. So now we'll look at how PCS operates, okay? And sometimes I think this perhaps sounds more complicated than it is, so I'll try and explain it in the most simple way I can. So when a payment is sent, a copy of the message is routed to payment controls, and the original message will continue its normal flow through the SWIFT infrastructure. However, the message that is the copy of the message, which is sent into SWIFT payment controls, can then be screened against various rules that you have configured. Now, you can configure those rules to be blocking, which means they can block a payment if they are hit, or they can be non-blocking. So that might be something if you just want to monitor the types of payment anomalies that are happening, okay? And then based on whether it's a blocking alert or a non-blocking alert, if it was a blocking alert, you can make a decision that you then want to have someone review it before it's released or aborted. And that means before you let the payment go, or before actually you may no longer want to proceed with that payment. Again, ensuring that you're intercepting any problematic payments early on where applicable. Okay, now one thing that's really important to note here is that the intention and the objective of PCS is not to replace your internal controls or fraud systems. It's actually trying to act as an additional control layer. So it's positioned at the critical point in the payment flow where the interception is still possible, right? So before it's actually left your institution. So like I say, it's not trying to replace, but rather act as an additional control on top to help intercept problematic payments early on. Now, we'll move on now to our core detection capabilities and how PCS actually helps to keep your payments safe. So there are primarily three different layers of PCS. You've got your institution-based rules, your network-based rules, and the anomaly scoring. We'll start with the institution-based rules. Now, essentially, these are all based on the core principle of you know what's normal for you and your institution. So, for example, it's based on your corridors, your currency, your typical business hours, your thresholds, your allow and forbid lists. And everything is fully configurable around what you would define as normal versus an anomaly. So essentially the way it works is it will be based on your institution traffic data to monitor those expected volumes, values and flows. And all of the rules, as I say, are based on your institution's patterns. So these are all obviously essential, but they do share one limitation, and that's that they are all institution centric. So this is where banks typically lack a bit of visibility beyond their perimeter. So that's where we move on to the network-based rules. Now, your network-based rules, which are also often referred to as the anomaly markers, many of these are upcoming and actually being piloted over Q2 and Q3 this year. However, we do have one live, which is repetitive payments already today. Now, your network-based rules essentially leverage the SWIFT network insights, and it can detect behaviors that are unusual, not only for your bank, but for the entire network. So, for example, whether an account is suddenly active across multiple institutions, whether a beneficiary or corridor is behaving unusual at network level, or whether a pattern is isolated or systemic. Okay. And finally, then you've got anomaly scoring. And really what anomaly scoring does is it ties everything together. So the scoring looks at behavioral patterns over time to determine how unusual a payment really is. So rather than just saying this is an anomaly, this is abnormal, it puts a score around it and defines, okay, out of 0 to 1,000, we would put it here on this rating, and this is the anomaly score that we would provide it. So it's really looking to determine how unusual that payment is. And instead of treating every deviation as equally important, which obviously is near on impossible to do, it helps your teams prioritize and make sure that they're paying attention to the payments that truly deserve it, if you like, rather than the ones that are maybe have a lower score. So it's essentially an AI overlay to tie it all together. And we can show you an example of that shortly as well. Okay. So now I'll move on to the institution-based rules. So that's the one that are all based on you and your institution and your corridor and so on. So now that we've introduced the three main layers, we'll spend a little bit of time looking a bit more closely at these. Now, as you can see here on this slide, it says there are 7 rules to detect anomalies, but only 5 boxes. So 3 of those rules are actually bunched together in the threshold-based rules. So the single payment, amount aggregation, and message count. And we'll talk about each one of these in turn now. So with regards to the new scenario, that's looking to detect anything new. So a new currency that your network may be sending in, a new corridor that it's leveraging that it hasn't leveraged before, and so on. Business calendar. So the business calendar rules is another big one, actually. So most operational fraud and a good portion of internal errors occur when processes fall outside of the usual rhythm, right? So during the weekends, maybe late at night, or unexpected bank holidays. And PCS can essentially flag anything that deviates from your normal business calendar. And again, that's all fully configurable in the tool. So it's not based on a standard 9 to 5. You can actually configure what those exact business hours and days are. Okay. Then you have the threshold-based rules. So single payment, first of all, is probably our most widely used rule today. And that's where you can actually apply a threshold to a single payment. So for example, you want to hit or an alert if a payment is over $10,000 as an example. Next, you've got aggregated amount threshold. So that's when you have multiple different payments that might exceed a certain amount when aggregated together. And again, you can define the amount and the period of time that those payments would need to be sent between. And then you've got message count thresholds as well. So how many payment messages are actually sent over a certain period of time. And again, you can define the period of time and also the number of messages that you would consider abnormal in those instances. Then we've also got account monitoring. Now, with account monitoring, essentially that lets you create forbid lists of accounts, allow lists, and also known high risk accounts. So this may be an instance that you might use a blocking rule if there was a certain particularly high risk account that you did not want any funds to go to, and then you saw something coming out of your network that was actually going to one of those funds. And again, like I say, that could be a good instance for a blocking rule. And finally, PCS lets you combine rules. So this for me is almost really what ties everything together, and it's actually something that many institutions underutilize today. So it really looks to combine risk conditions and allows you to express more nuanced risk appetite. So for example, you may choose to simply have a non-blocking rule set for a new currency or for a single payment amount. However, you might decide that actually if there is a new currency and a payment that's over $10,000 that is happening outside of the business calendar hours, then maybe you want to block that payment. So that's what that rules combination essentially lets you do. So it lets you combine the rules and then apply a different alert type to it. Okay. So now we'll go on to the second layer, which, as I said, is the network-based rules. And these are often referred to as anomaly markers, so you may have heard of them referred to in that instance too. Now, first of all, just before we get into some more of the details on these, I'd like to just make a note of the timelines here. So all of these are due to be released should the pilot be successful to all customers at the end of 2026. Today we have one live now, which is repetitive payments, and that is live for non-blocking only, but the blocking will be live from Q3. Now, new account, new currency, unusual amount, and unusual volume are being piloted during the course of Q2 and Q3, with a pilot for problematic account reuse beginning in Q3. Okay. Now, let's talk a little bit about what the network-based rules actually do then. So network-based rules are designed to surface patterns that become visible only when you step back and look at how accounts behave globally. So some of the key rule types that are part of the network-based layer, as I mentioned, we're already live with repetitive payments now. Now, honestly, it does what it says on the tin. It detects repeated payments of the same or similar amounts involving the same account. And that's at network level. You also have the option to actually look at the institution level for each of these as well. Then we have new accounts, which will detect accounts that have never appeared on the Swift network or that have extremely low historical activity. You've got new currency, which is very similar to the new account one. And it looks for accounts suddenly transacting in a currency they've never used before, which can be a red flag for laundering patterns or impersonation schemes as well. Next, you've got unusual amount and volume. So they aggregate network level behavior to highlight accounts exchanging amounts or volume that deviate from what's considered normal across the ecosystem. So it's really done using averages for this one. So it's not just what's unusual for you, but what's unusual for everyone. And then finally, problematic account reuse. So this is one of the most powerful rules, really. And this detects accounts that are already linked to returns, recalls, rejects, or aborted payments somewhere else in the network. So these are often seen as the tip of the iceberg indicators that something isn't right. So again, this may be an instance where you may decide to use a blocking rule in this sort of instance. Okay, now finally we're going to go on, before we move on to the demo, to the deep dive on anomaly scoring. So I mentioned the 3 layers. We've covered the institution-based rules, the network-based rules, and now we're doing the third, which is the anomaly scoring, which is that AI overlay piece, which essentially ties everything all together. Okay, so if the institution-based rules tell us what's normal inside your own perimeter, then the anomaly scoring is the layer that blends all the rules into one behavioral perspective on each payment. So the concept is quite simple, really. So a payment can pass every rule, yet still behave in a way that is statistically unusual when you look at it holistically. And that's exactly what this feature captures. So anomaly scoring analyzes each outgoing payment against your historical traffic patterns. So things like typical amounts, usual corridors, timing, frequency, counterparties, and so on. And essentially, it then asks, how far does this payment deviate from your normality? And it gives a score of between 0 and 1,000, a low score meaning the payment fits well within your traditional behavior, and a high score meaning the payment stands out. So it's really not about one single red flag, but more it's about the patterns of deviation. And you can see on the screen here, it will also always show you the contributing factors and why that score has actually been placed in the way it has. Okay. Now I will now switch over to the demo. So just give me one moment, please, and I will maximize my screen and then share it. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see my screen. This is the payment controls landing page. Now, essentially what you can see here is the home page, if you like. Now, payment controls shares its landing page with transaction screening, so you may notice that at the top here. And what we'll be walking through now is a few different elements of this page. So first of all, on the landing page, you'll see updates on new features and so on, interesting news. You can also find links to documentation, support, and so on at the bottom. You can also see your administration tabs, your reporting, your payment controls, and your alerts at the top. Now, the first thing that you'd be asked to do once you onboard to payment controls is set up 2 users. Now, if you like, they are super users, which means they have all roles provided to them. And what they then need to do is set up the remaining users. So to do that, they can go into the administration section here, click Manage Users and Roles. And then these have been pre-set up because this is a demo environment. They can go into their business unit, and here you can see the full roles that can be allocated to each of your different users. Now, professional services will help you to do this, to set up your users. But essentially, we always advise that obviously you have some element of segregation within your team. And once those 2 initial users have set up all of the role configurations for the users, we actually advise that then those 2 initial users would then be deleted from the platform, because otherwise they almost have too much power. So that's always the sort of first steps. So this is how you can see that everything can be fully segregated up to the point that you would like it to be. Next, if we go into the payment control section at the top here, I'm going to click on the manage rule sets. Now, like I say, this is a demo environment, so what you're seeing here wouldn't necessarily look exactly the same for yourselves, and this is all dummy data. So this is a rule set that's been created for the purpose of this demo. So if we click on here, we can then see the main rule set home page. Now, at the top here, you can see alert, workflow, and timer information. Now, this is where you can actually edit the how your alert settings work. So you can see at the top, you have alert workflow for alerts with at least one blocking hit. Now, remembering again that a blocking alert means that a payment will not be released, you can then simply decide, is that okay that one person makes a decision, or would you rather have a 4-eye check on that? And you can configure that here. On the non-blocking side, which you see here, there is only the option to give an acknowledgement, remembering again that the non-blocking hits is for monitoring purposes only. Then you can see here that we can actually set a decision time frame for handling a blocking alert. So for example, if somebody hasn't responded and made a decision on a blocking alert within 24 hours or 12 hours or however you may choose to configure it, what is the default setting? So this is the timer, and then also what should the default setting be as well to that, okay? And then you can also set an escalation timer for the notification as well where applicable. The next thing I'd like to point out to you, which I think is particularly helpful when you're first leveraging PCS and when you're learning how to use the platform, is you'll see when you're defining your rules, you have this nice little step-by-step tutorial button available here with the little footprints. And essentially within this button, this click is a wealth of information. So you can look at it from a use case perspective or also a rule perspective. And let's say, for example, we're looking at use case 3, so block payments to specific counterparty using the single payment rule. You can simply click Get Started. Here you have a full PDF guide of the use case. You can also see about the rules, the use case scenario, and the prerequisites to using this as well. Okay, you can see lots of different information. And what's very nice actually when you're first starting to use PCS is if you actually start that configuration, what you can do is it will literally walk you through step by step everything that you need to do. So for example, it will say add rule, and then it will tell you that next you need to click your live or test, and you can do it all in real time with the tutorial as your guide essentially. Okay. Now, the next thing I'll show you is here we have a few different rules that have been added for us. So you can see here the rule type, the trigger, you can see the rule title that's been configured, you can see whether it's active or live, whether there's an expiry action that's been configured, and so on. Now, and also your message types here. Now, let's say I wanted to add a new rule. I could simply click on Add New Rule, as we saw a moment ago in the tutorial. I can select to use a live or test option. So some of our customers, or many of our customers, would first set up their rule set using the test option to simply see how it works first of all and check it works for them. And then you can later change it to live. Now, again, you can see here this the differentiation between our institution-based rules and our Swift network-based or anomaly markers. As I mentioned, this is the demo environment. So actually, you can see here that we have more network-based rules than are currently live. So if you were logging in today, you would just see the repetitive payments option here. So again, let's say we're looking at the institution-based. Here are our 7 rules that you can configure. If I click on single payment, which is our most used institution-based rules, we can simply click on it here. And here you have the option to do your rule title and whatever works for you. You can add your rule action, so whether it's blocking or non-blocking. If I select blocking, I then need to also put down a decision expiry action. So once it expires, should it abort or should it release? Abort the payment or release the payment, okay? So I can choose that as I see fit. I can then also select the message types and applicable messaging BICs that I would like this to apply to, and then select of the actors involved. And you can go as detailed as you like with this, depending on exactly how you want to leverage the tool. Finally, you can see here, select which currencies to use. And then at the bottom is obviously the key information where you actually put into your amount, whether it's 10,000 US dollars and so on. Okay. And then you simply select Save Rule, and that's it all done. Okay. So that gives you a little bit of an overview of how to add the rules. Now what I'm going to show you is what the alerts look like. So what do you see when there has been a hit? So if I click in the alerts here, again, you can see our transaction screening alerts available there if you're also a user of transaction screening. But then we can click on the live alerts under the payment controls section here, which I will do now. So here you have an overview of all of the live alerts that are available for me to review. So there's an option to address them in bulk. You can see here bulk action, and I can simply select and then address it by clicking on that button. We can also see whether the type of hit. So this is really the key bit that I think is most important to be looking at. You can see the red with the blocking symbol. That simply means it's a blocking hit. And then here we see that these are the non-blocking hits. And we can also see the status of these various alerts. Okay. Now, if I and also the other thing to mention is the anomaly score. So the overlay that ties everything together. Remember, it's a score from 0 to 1,000, which then also, if your team is then reviewing this will help them to determine which ones they want to prioritize. Remembering again that the higher the score, the more important it is. So they would probably start off by looking at one with a higher score rather than one with a lower score. Okay, but for the sake of this demo, we're just going to go in right at the top. And here you can see an overview of what this alert is. So you can see it contains 2 blocking and 3 non-blocking hits. So the blocking ones are mentioned here in red and the non-blocking are here in grey. You can click into each one and there will be a little section that says scenario, and it will explain exactly what's happened and why the hit is there. You can then review these and simply determine whether you want to release the payment, abort the payment, or investigate. So if I decided to release the payment, as an example, I can then simply type in my comments here. Okay, all of these comments will pull forward onto your reporting as well. So if you later wanted to review in bulk why certain decisions have been made, that can also be done by the reporting tab, which I'll show you in a moment. Okay, similarly, if I want to abort the payment, I can simply type in here the rationale, and then you simply click confirm, and that will then remove the payment and put a decision on it. Remove the alert and put the decision on abort. Okay. Now, the other thing I'd like to show you quickly, just before we move to the reporting, is the anomaly scoring section here. So here you can see, this is very similar to the screenshot that we saw earlier. Here you can see the contributing factors behind the score that's there, and you can also see where this sits. Okay, whether it be very low, low, high, or very high, and then the rationale for that as well. Okay. So now what I would like to do is we'll go back to the home page, and then we'll move forward towards the reporting. So if I click on the reporting section at the top up here, we have a couple of different reports available. The first one is the PCS alerts report. Now, this is essentially a consolidated view of all of your alerts. So this is essentially a full audit report of your alert status. You can fully configure the frequency, whether it be daily, weekly, monthly, and so on. And like I say, this is really for audit purposes of the alerts themselves. Then you've got your payment activity report as well. And here you will see the full information about the activities that have actually taken place from your payment perspective as well. Okay. Now, that really essentially covers the most important parts of payment control systems. I mean, obviously we have multiple rules that we can show you in detail, but really that would come as part of the onboarding process with professional services. So what I will now do is I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint. Just bear with me 1 second. Okay. And now we will talk a little bit about what's next on the journey. So if you'd like to onboard and actually start using PCS, all you need to do is contact your account manager for more information. They'll be able to provide you with quotations and so on, and then you can just place an e-order using the quotation provided on Swift.com. So the whole process from getting started, so planning your project, submitting your e-order and so on, takes around 3 months between starting and go live. And you will be speaking with one of our professional services representatives who will be able to support you through that process as well, which certainly makes the onboarding much easier. So with that, I think that wraps up this presentation. Thank you very much for joining. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to let me know, or indeed put them on the chat, and of course we will answer them. Okay. In that case, if there are no questions, thank you so much for your time, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.